The presentation is Toxins in the Environment of Southern Nevada. And this topic was of interest to me because I have lived here probably about a dozen years, and my background is in safety and industrial hygiene and public health. And I was quite taken aback by how much information I was accumulating on a lot of the interesting challenges we have living in the Southwest. So I have a master's degree in industrial safety management, and I'm a certified safety professional. So I always look at the world in a slightly different way, looking at things from a safety point of view. And I'm currently president of my husband and my company, Occupational and Environmental Health Consulting Services. So this is kind of looking at the Southwest from a slightly different point of view, and I hope you find it interesting. It is required whenever we do a presentation that we make sure that people understand that all of our programs at the University of Nevada are federally funded and open to everyone. We also have a copy of the poster available if you're interested. Okay, so these are the things we'll be talking about this evening. We're going to look at pathogenic and toxic organisms that we have in our environment. Also, we'll be looking at some plant toxins and irritants and some of the native plants, since many of them grow very slowly, they have some type of mechanism. Some of them are armored, some of them have chemicals in them that deter them from being eaten or trampled. And then also we'll talk about some hazardous chemicals we have in the environment, including naturally occurring asbestos. Now, just a little bit of a prologue. Our goal is not to dissuade you from enjoying the great outdoors. We don't want to turn you off to the outdoors, but we want to provide you with useful knowledge to help you recreate safely for many years to come. Now, that's kind of what our goal is. The first thing we'll talk about are some pathogenic or toxic organisms that we find in our environment. One of them is called San Joaquin Valley fever, or Coccidioides immitis. Coccidioides mycosis is the actual disease. Tetanus, some of you I'm sure have heard about that. Disease is caused by different types of parasites such as Toxoplasma and Giardia. Also, hantavirus is another one that we're finding more information on in the Southwest. And also something called rose handler's disease. So these are different pathogenic toxic organisms, and also invertebrates. There's a whole host of those. I'm sure some of you have encountered them in your travels and hikes. Scorpions, snakes, black widow spiders, Africanized bees, fire ants, and mosquitoes. And we're very fortunate that the master gardeners get kept up to date on an annual basis from the state entomologist, Jeffrey Knight, who comes down to our meetings once a year and updates us on the status of these risks in Southern Nevada. So I can give you some of the up-to-date information on how risky some of these might be. And good news is a lot of the risks are low, but it's still important to be aware of them so that we know if we do encounter these, how we should proceed. Okay. Then as far as plant toxins and irritants are concerned, we're going to talk next about plants. I know that Dr. Don Devers did a talk for you not long ago, and he mentioned a lot of plants that you can eat and some that you don't want to eat. So we'll talk very briefly about some of the hazardous plants that are native to Southern Nevada, such as hemlock, gopher plant, which is in the spurge family, sacred datura, and globe mallow. And then we'll also briefly talk about a few that you might find more in a urban environment, people's yards, and some of the ornamentals that we have, such as oleanders, lantana, and Texas mountain laurel. Again, this is just a small sample of the toxic plants that exist. And if you go to the ASPCA website and look up their list of toxic plants, it is countrywide, and it includes house plants as well as outdoor plants. Their list is over 1,000 plants long of potentially toxic plants. So again, this is just a small sample, but ones I thought might be of most of interest to those of you living in Southern Nevada. Okay. Then lastly, we'll talk about toxic chemicals in our environment. Briefly, we'll talk a little bit about the naturally occurring outcroppings we have of asbestos in the soil near Las Vegas. And if there's interest and if there's time, we might mention a little bit about some of the pesticide issues that have been brought to light in recent years. Okay, So well, first, we're going to talk about the pathogenic and toxic organisms. Typically, when we look at different organisms that can cause problems and disease, we find that fungi typically infect plants and bacteria typically infect animals, including humans. But we're finding that there is some crossover between some what we call opportunistic species of mold or fungi that can affect immunocompromised individuals. And that includes senior citizens. According to the Centers for Disease Control, those of us 60 and older are considered to be immunocompromised, or that our immune system is not as good as it used to be at fighting off infections, including fungal infections. Okay. So one that is somewhat rare but still potentially fatal is called San Joaquin Valley fever. And some people just refer to it as valley fever. And it is a fairly rare disease. It's caused by what we call a thermophilic fungus. Thermophilic means it's a heat-loving fungus. So it survives in our soil, and if it gets inhaled, it survives in our lungs because of the temperature, our body temperature. And it's naturally occurring in the soils in some areas of California, particularly the San Joaquin Valley, where it got its name and was first identified. But it's also found in Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah. Once it's inhaled, it produces flu-like symptoms: fever, cough, fatigue, headache, muscle aches, and joint pains. And typically, if you're exposed to dust that has this in it, that's when it gets inhaled, and that's how you would get exposed. So typically, if you're anywhere near a farmer's field or a construction site or quarries or hiking on a very windy day, these might be instances where you could be exposed to the valley fever fungus. And again, those people who are susceptible, again, residents who are over 60 years of age, people with chronic illnesses, people who are exposed to large quantities of airborne dust and dirt. And what's interesting too is recent transplants to the Southwest are folks that are more susceptible. People that grew up in this area probably have breathed in a little bit of the fungus over their lifetime and have actually developed a certain amount of immunity. Those of us who have moved here from other parts of the country, especially as seniors, are likely to be more susceptible. Okay. There was an article in the Las Vegas Review Journal back in 2007 that reported 72 cases of valley fever in the Las Vegas Valley. And I'm trying to get more updated information from the public health department, but they are a little busy right now with the current pandemic to help me in get more up-to-date information, but I'm hoping to do that. So if you do have flu-like symptoms, and it's not the flu, maybe if it lasts for a month or more, you may think, well, this is not the flu, maybe it's something else. Your doctor may say, well, it could be seasonal allergies. And typically what they do for seasonal allergies is they give you steroids. However, if it is valley fever or any kind of fungal infection, the last thing you want to do is to take steroids. Steroids reduces your body's immune response and allows the fungus to grow and take over, basically. It's using your body as food, is what it's doing. So what you would do, let's say you do have a long-term flu-like symptoms, you go to the doctor, I would ask for a test, sputum test or blood test for fungal antibodies, and rule out the possibility of valley fever before they prescribe the steroids. Untreated or improperly treated, it's fatal in about 2% of cases. And just on a personal note, my mother almost died of valley fever back about 2 decades ago when they moved from Pennsylvania to California. And she got in a dusty area and she caught it, and they didn't catch it for a long, long time. So because it is kind of rare, it is important to keep aware of these symptoms so that you may be the one to tell your doctor, hey, wait a minute, I just went hiking, it was dusty, a couple months ago, blah, blah, blah. He may not even think to ask. Okay. There is no vaccine for it yet. We try to avoid dusty activities, or if you know it's going to be a windy day, we've been wearing a lot of masks with the pandemic, so grab your mask and take it with you. An N95 would be a very good health preventative measure on that. Okay, and also change, wash your clothes after a dusty activity. Okay. Okay, that is valley fever. Again, if you have any further questions on that, that's something that you can Google, and there is a good bit of information on the internet regarding valley fever. Most everybody is familiar with tetanus. Okay, it's a bacteria found in the soil, dust, and animal feces. When it gets into a deep wound, it can cause the actual disease, tetanus, or what they sometimes refer to as lockjaw. And it's important to get vaccinated for this. They usually recommend it for infants, teens, children, teens, and adults to prevent tetanus. It's part of the DPT vaccine that is generally given as routinely to children. And they recommend a booster every 10 years and also after any kind of puncture wound. In fact, I'll be getting one next week because I stepped on a piece of metal in my son's yard that went through my shoe and into my heel. So that's an issue where it was a fairly deep puncture wound. So my interest is to get another booster just to be on the safe side. So be sure that your tetanus boosters are up to speed. Okay. Hantavirus is an interesting one. Some people may or may not be familiar with that. It's a viral disease that's spread through infected rodent feces and urine. The host is a deer mouse. It's not your typical, household mouse, but they are present throughout the Western and Central US and also Canada. It is endemic in Washoe County, and the variety that we typically have in Southern Nevada is called sin nombre, which means without a name. So I don't know how that particular name came about, but it is responsible for a majority of the cases of the hantavirus infection. And there's a picture of the cute little deer mouse in the bottom right-hand corner. Again, there's more information from cdc.gov at hantavirus if you want to have more information about that. The symptoms include fever, fatigue, muscle aches, especially large muscle groups, and those symptoms are universal. Occasionally, people do get the symptoms listed below: headache, dizziness, chills, etc. The kind of scary thing about hantavirus is the mortality rate. Roughly 50% of people who contract hantavirus will die from it. So again, it's one of the things that's fairly rare, but if you get it, can be fairly serious. Okay. So some of the ways to prevent it. You want to eliminate or minimize contact with rodents in the home, workplace, or on a campsite. So be mindful of where you're camping. There was one instance where there was some federal campsites, I believe it was in Arizona, where they were like little tents that they had put up that were like a double layer of canvas, and people could rent these out and stay a weekend or whatever while they're camping and enjoying the area. And mice had gotten into between the two layers of canvas, and they had spread hantavirus there. And a number of people who went camping in those tents passed away from hantavirus. Okay. So it is important, again, to try and be aware of that. If you're camping in an area, try and make sure that it's a fairly clean area and you don't see any droppings of the animals there. Okay. The next one we'll talk about briefly is a couple of different parasites that can be found in the water and soil. Toxoplasmosis is a fairly rare disease caused by a parasite that's found throughout the world and infects some wild and even domestic animals. Common exposure routes is if you're touching or cleaning up feces or urine of a cat or dog that has ingested contaminated animal or has drank water that has the parasite in it, or dust exposure where these things have frequented. That's one of the concerns we have with gardeners, is that if a cat uses your garden as a litter box and then you're in there digging around and stirring it up, that's not a good thing. And this information comes from a local source here in Las Vegas, the Haven Animal Hospital fact sheet. So it is definitely something that can pop up even in our dry, arid climate, to have these parasites in our soil. Okay. We again have flu-like symptoms. Mild cases have no symptoms. But the big concern here is that it's teratogenic. in pregnant women. And teratogenic means it can cause birth defects. So those of us who are, not in that category where we are or may become pregnant, it's not really a big issue. But that's one of the reasons, if you've ever heard that pregnant women aren't supposed to clean the cat's litter box, is because there could be toxoplasma in the litter box, or digging out in the dirt again if cats have used that as litter boxes. Okay. So basically, we don't touch soil that may have animal feces in it. And this is true even for feral cats that might be in some of your parks, or dogs possibly. So again, just be careful and try and stay away from any of those potential sources. Now, Giardia is another one that we've seen. I've talked to a physician, a retired physician here in Las Vegas, and she said that she had a number of cases of giardiasis in patients that she had seen that lived in the Las Vegas Valley. Again, it's very similar to the toxoplasma. Its main exposure routes are through animals who are infected, dogs and cats, either domesticated or feral. Okay, very similar symptoms. They do have anti-parasitic medication that people can take. Okay, again, prevention is very similar. Don't be exposed to contaminated soils or areas where they have animal feces. If you have to clean up animal feces, try and wear gloves, wash your hands afterwards, etc. Okay, the last of the nasties in the soil and air that we're going to talk about that can cause infection is rose handler's disease. It's called sporotrichosis. And again, it's a fairly rare disease. It's caused by another type of thermophilic fungus, similar to the valley fever. And it is naturally found worldwide, not only on roses, but hay, sphagnum moss, and pine needles. So again, for campers and hikers, you may be exposed to maybe pine needles walking through a forest or setting up a campsite or whatever. If you're stuck or scraped by any of these items and it punctures the skin, it can cause the infection of the fungus to get in under the skin and result in an infection. It starts out as like a firm pink or purple bump that forms under the skin, and it can take months for this to occur. It can be painless or it can be mildly tender. I decided not to include any of the pictures, but again, if you were to Google sporotrichosis, you can see some rather horrific looking pictures of people who are immunocompromised and how this fungus just starts to creep up the leg and cause these great big ulcers going up a person's leg, which again are very extreme examples of it. I know of 2 master gardeners who've actually gotten sporotrichosis from working with their roses, and they stay as a fairly small but persistent bump. And typically the doctor will give you a prescription iodine solution, but it can take months or years for that treatment to actually cure the infection. So again, the best thing is try to stay away from rose thorns, pine needles and things. Wear gloves when you're working around them or cleaning up around them. Okay. And also avoiding steroids with any fungal infection is important because that will hamper your immune system. Okay, so we'll move on now to our hazardous environmental pests, which I'm sure that some of you probably have had some close encounters with, possibly in any of your hiking, camping experiences. But we're going to just briefly go over this list of invertebrates that can have venom or other problems that can affect you. We have scorpions, snakes, Gila monster, black widow spiders, Africanized bees, fire ants, and also mosquito-borne illnesses. So we're going to very briefly look at each of those. As far as scorpions are concerned, we have about 25 species of scorpions in Nevada. The Arizona bark scorpion is the most venomous in North America and is a common pest in the Las Vegas Valley. And there's a picture of that little guy up on the right. And I have heard of certain parts of the valley where they have had outbreaks with scorpions. Some of it is believed to be on imported plants, particularly palm trees that are brought in from Arizona or California. Now, the stinger releases a neurotoxin that is painful and can be potentially harmful. I had a master gardener friend who moved here from Maryland 3 years ago, got stung by a scorpion in her garage, and she said it was more painful than childbirth. So she had a really rough time with it. Most at risk are the elderly, young children, and pets. because of their typically their immune system or their smaller size. So if anyone fits into those categories, and if you're stung, it's generally not a bad idea to go to the emergency room and just make sure that you do okay and survive that experience. They say also that the younger scorpions are more likely to inflict more pain because they haven't gotten a lot of control over how much venom they release. Where the older ones know how much they need to release in order to repel a predator, for example, where the young ones will dump everything they've got because they aren't that well adept at dispensing it. Kind of interesting. Okay, we're going to move on to rattlesnakes. Nevada is home to 5 different rattlesnake species that can be dangerous to people and to pets. They have the 5 pictures there on the right are the sidewinder, the Mojave rattlesnake, the speckled rattlesnake, the western diamondback, and the Great Basin rattlesnake, which is also called the western rattlesnake. It's very important to remember that rattlesnakes do not always rattle their tails in warning, and a rattle does not always precede a strike. The University of Nevada Cooperative Extension has over 800 fact sheets on different aspects of gardening and environment. And one that I would highly recommend, if you're interested, is the Venomous Reptiles of Nevada fact sheet. And it's listed there on the bottom. And you can get free copies of that from University of Nevada Cooperative Extension website. So if you have any other questions on the availability of that, let me know and I can get you more info. Okay. Well, it's interesting thing that is in that fact sheet is they show the difference between venomous and non-venomous snakes, which is kind of good to know out in the field. For the most part, your non-venomous snakes have a narrow head and a thin body and pointed tail with no rattle. Where the venomous snakes have a broader head, thicker body, and a rattle. With one exception, there's the gopher snake, which is non-venomous, but he'll puff up his head and he'll rattle like he is a venomous snake. But those are the major differences for the most part between the two. Okay, there have been no rattlesnake related deaths as of the article that I got out of the Reno Gazette as of 2017. Don't know if there have been any others since then. But about 7,000 to 8,000 people get bitten every year. And then throughout the country, they say about 5 of those per year are fatal. Okay. So again, prevention is just to stay out of their way, be aware of your surroundings when you're reaching or stepping in crevices, rocks, or brush. Most bites result from deliberate harassment of reptiles. And all of us are not going to be in that category, but that's what generally happens. And also, even after they're dead, they can have somewhat of a post-mortem reaction where they can strike out. So even if something looks dead, I wouldn't go near it. Okay. Another interesting fact that we get from the UNCE fact sheet is that if a venomous reptile is seen in an area where it poses a direct threat to human safety, they want you to call the Nevada Department of Wildlife's hotline. And that's the number below. You can take that with you when you go out. And if you do see one in an area that could pose a threat to people or pets, they request that you alert them of that. Okay. Again, be careful when you're hiking. Also choose your campsites carefully. Carry a flashlight when you're walking at night. And a couple of other items there: supervise children's activity, check under your car on hot days in case a reptile is seeking shade, and keep your Snoopy pets on a leash. Okay. Now, Gila monsters are supposedly rather rare to find because they typically mostly come out at night. They are also a protected species, so we are not allowed to do anything to harm them. They spend most of their life underground, and there's some pictures that we have here of the different varieties of Gila monster. The top picture, the middle picture are, but they can also be confused for a non-venomous reptile called the chuckwallas, and that is the picture on the bottom is the chuckwalla. Okay. If you are bitten by a snake or Gila monster, your primary goal is to get emergency medical treatment ASAP. If you believe you've been bitten, Don't wait for symptoms to show up. Typically, you want to immobilize the victim, keep the wound below the heart. Do not use a tourniquet or the old suction technique that they used to show on TV shows. And they say don't not even put ice on the wound. Calm the victim. You don't want the rapid pulse to help circulate the venom. And remove all jewelry in case the body parts do swell, but definitely get them to an emergency center ASAP. Okay. If you can identify the creature if possible, that helps them if they need to do an anti-venom treatment. Okay. Again, it doesn't mean that just because you got bitten doesn't mean certain death. Only 1/10 of 1% of venomous bites result in deaths. Okay, but again, it's good to be on the safe side. Okay, so that's our little bit on snakes. Again, if you want more information, you can Google any of these items and get the university fact sheet for more information. The black widows, I think most everybody has probably seen the black widow if you've been out in the Southwest for any length of time. And the females are considered most venomous snake in North America. The male and the juveniles are considered to be harmless, though I have heard some cases where that may not always be true. The adults are about a 1/2 inch long, and they have the red or orange hourglass or circular shape on the underside of the abdomen. What's interesting about the black widows, even though they're very small, their venom is 15 times as toxic as the venom of a rattlesnake. Okay, I got bitten by a black widow in the garden about 3 years ago, and I still had tingling and pain in my calf for about a year before it finally went away. Yeah, so it's very interesting how long it may take for some of this to clear your system. One good way to identify that black widows are in the area are the very cottony, sticky webs that they weave. It's not your typical classic spider web that you see like on different stylized items around Halloween. It's a very cottony, very diffuse looking. And the picture to the right shows you what the webbing looks like. Okay, they're often found near the ground, near storage areas, crevices, and things like that. Vacuum cleaners can be used to remove them and their eggs, or some people just prefer to call an exterminator. Okay. The Africanized bees, we've seen a little bit of information on this on the news about Africanized bees. It's basically a hybrid of the Western honeybee, which is very prolific in collecting honey, and the African bees, which are larger. So they had hoped that this hybrid would be a bigger and better bee. Unfortunately, that didn't turn out that way. What they found is that they didn't do a lot more to collect honey, but they retained some of the characteristics of the African bees, the African honeybees. They attack in large numbers, because if you're in Africa and you're at a beehive and this great big rhinoceros attacks your hive, you need a lot of bees to respond to repel that large animal. So even if a person, say in the United States, is walking by a hive that's Africanized bees, you walk by, create a pounding sound that alerts them, you're going to get tens of thousands of bees coming out to respond. And the hives can form in a number of different types of locations. What's interesting, a lot of our native bees do not form hives. They are pretty much loners, and they may burrow in the ground. They may burrow in a rotten piece of wood, and they're generally fairly docile. They don't typically attack in large groups. So if you do see a hive, such as we see in this picture, that can be an indication that the hive has become Africanized. Okay. They got the name killer bees because they will viciously attack people and animals. They basically go for all of your orifices, and they look for carbon dioxide. So they go in your ears, in your nose, in your mouth, and they can cause some very serious injury. Any loud noises or even walking by the nest can be enough to arouse them to attack. And their venom isn't any more potent, but again, it's the sheer number that can attack. So if you're attacked by Africanized bees, this is what the desertusa.com website says to do, is hold your breath, because again, they're looking for the CO2. Run to an enclosed shelter place if you can. And if you do get stung, don't try and grab the bee and pull it off, because that can squeeze more of the venom into the skin, but to scrape them off. Okay. So hopefully that will never happen. But again, it's always good to know the what ifs. The state entomologist, Jeff Knight, says that they are very actively seeking out any Africanized bees in southern Nevada. They do find them, they go in and they deal with that. And they're also licensing all of the beekeepers in the area so that they can keep track of their bees, of their hives, and make sure that they have proper education in recognizing Africanized beehives. So I think we have pretty good control over that at this point. But again, it's just always good to be aware. If you do find that there is an area where you assume Africanized bees, not a bad idea to contact the state entomologist up in Carson City. Okay. Next, our little fun organism will be fire ants. And I'm sure you've heard a lot on the news too about fire ants. And they were introduced to the Las Vegas area by imported plants, similar to what we found with the scorpions. They're small, but they're very aggressive, and they can cause a variety of problems with their very painful bites. They seek out moist areas. If you're near a golf course or any irrigated part of a park or any standing water, that they can be present. There was a crazy TV show. I don't know if any of you ever saw it, but being in public health, my husband and I enjoy this kind of, I don't know if it's a morbid curiosity, but it's a show called 1,000 Ways to Die. And each episode talks about crazy things that have happened to people that have resulted in their demise. And in one episode, they talked about two very bored teenage boys in Texas who decided they were going to snort fire ants. So they got some fire ants and they got some straws and they actually snorted them up into their nostrils. And within 5 minutes, they were history. It just swelled everything up and they asphyxiated and they died. Kind of scary. So again, don't snort any fire ants. And also they recommend that we don't try, and if you see any red ants, just eradicate all the ants in your yard with pesticides, because that can leave a vacuum where you don't have any competition between the good ants and the bad ants. And it can make the area even more susceptible to a fire ant infestation. Okay, so again, I had the information down that Jeff Knight is our Nevada State entomologist. Feel free if you have any further questions or want to know maybe where they are finding fire ants anymore in the valley or in central Nevada. He would be able to give you any more current information. Okay, the last creature we'll talk about are mosquitoes. And the concern is mosquito-borne illnesses. Now, they're not ubiquitous in southern Nevada. They do pop up here and there. If there's stagnant water, such as ponds or swimming pools that aren't properly maintained, gutters and things like that, the mosquito larvae can survive. Since we've been 270 some days without rain, probably we're not going to see a lot of mosquito-borne illness this year, hopefully. But the three major illnesses that they can carry are the West Nile virus, the Western equine encephalitis, and the St. Louis encephalitis. And within the Clark County Health Department, since 2004, we've had 106 probable or confirmed cases of West Nile reported due to mosquito bites, and 16 cases in 2019 alone. So again, this is not a zero risk, but a fairly low risk. So if you are camping in an area, maybe near a stream or near a pond, and there may be mosquitoes there, it's not a bad idea to continue to use mosquito repellent, long sleeves, and try and avoid being out at dawn and dusk when they are most likely to bite. And they do frequent testing. They have mosquito traps all over the valley. They take the mosquitoes that they trap and then they test them and see what percentage of them carry the West Nile virus. And back in 2019, in August, the last information we have is 17% of the mosquitoes in Las Vegas tested positive for West Nile virus. Okay. Okay, we're going to move on. If I didn't totally depress you with that, we'll move on to plant toxins and irritants. And as we said earlier, a lot of our native plants grow very slowly. And as a result, they need some kind of defense mechanism so that they don't get munched to the ground by other predators. So these are just a few of the ones that we're going to talk about. And just like we had mentioned before, um, we can't discuss them all. There's thousands of plants, but I'm going to discuss a few that I think might be most likely to be encountered by outdoorsy people like yourselves. Okay, so these are the ones we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about hemlock. And this info is courtesy of Dr. Don Devers. And I'm going to go lightly on that because Brenda said that you already did get a little information from Dr. Don about hemlock. But I'll just kind of give you the cliff notes of an hour-long lecture he gave the master gardeners just on hemlock. Okay, there's a lot of information on it. Okay, we're also going to talk about one of my favorite ornamentals, which is also a native, called the gopher plant or spurge, Euphorbia rigida, the sacred datura, and the globe mallow, which you can find growing out in the wild in southern Nevada. And the three that we'll talk about that are more ornamentals that you might find in people's yards or in parks and the like are your oleanders, lantana, and Texas mountain laurel. Okay, hemlock. Dr. Don Devers says about hemlock that it is the most edible looking poisonous plant in the world. And it's interesting because the roots look like wild parsnips. The leaves, the top right picture there, look like parsley or even carrot leaves. And the seeds, which come from the flower in the bottom picture, look like anise or fennel. So people that like to go out and grab things from the wild to eat have to be really, really careful with hemlock. It can be between 2 and 8 feet tall, and the stems are hollow and ribbed, and these tiny white flowers. It is extremely poisonous and it does not take much. Even people that have touched the stems or people that have used the hollow stems as like a straw or like a little, to shoot little ball wads or whatever, paper wads that other people to play around with, those people have had problems just with that small exposure to hemlock. And it's pretty prevalent throughout the United States and Canada. It's shown by this picture. The green areas show you the areas where hemlock can be found. So if you're out in the middle of the desert, the dry desert area, you're probably not going to see a lot of it. But if you're near a cultivated field, around a creek bed, or any irrigation ditches, any areas that may have moisture and shade, you may be likely to find the hemlock. Okay, quite a few symptoms associated with it. The fatality rate for poisonings generally is around 30%. That was a result of basically 75 years of epidemiological data to show that. Because what happened in many cases is people would try and clear it out of an area where you may be grazing animals. And by touching it, they would be exposed to it and be a problem. And a small percentage of that is people that actually were mistaking it for other food and would eat it. Okay. So again, we need to have a lot of respect if we do see any hemlock out there. Okay. If you do get in contact with it, if you rub up against it or you trip and fall and you land on a pile of it, want to rinse the skin off immediately with some kind of rubbing alcohol or soap or detergent, lots of water, and seek medical attention if you even suspect you contacted it, because it does not take long. Dr. Devers said it can take even just a few minutes for the hemlock to affect the central nervous system and stop someone breathing. So again, have a lot of respect for this naturally occurring herbaceous material. Okay, moving on to something a little less problematic is Euphorbia or spurge. His name is Euphorbia rigida, is the botanical name, but he goes by the common name of gopher plant a lot of times too. You can buy these in the store. You see them growing along the side of the road. A lot of the newer commercial developments that we've seen, like Arroyo Crossing down at 215 and Rainbow, have a bunch of the euphorbias planted as ornamentals in the islands surrounding the parking lots. Okay, they have a beautiful flower in the springtime. It's a perennial, so it comes back every year. but it contains a somewhat poisonous or irritating sap that even if you nick it a little bit, you get this milky white sap that comes out. And some people will get a rash if they get the sap on their skin, and it sets into a latex. And it's kind of like if you ever get spray glue on your hands and you just can't get it off, and they're always sticky, it's sticky for days. That's the thing that bothers me the most about this. I don't have a problem with the irritation. Some people do. I even know of one master gardener who can't even walk past the plant without it affecting her sinuses. So some people are very susceptible to it, others not so much. Okay. And euphorbias in general, it's a whole family of plants, some of which are very ornamental, can be house plants. Many of them can also have similar properties. So again, be careful of all your euphorbias. Okay. They contain diterpenes and triterpenes. If you wanted to know what chemical was involved, again, they can cause splashes. If you get it in your eye, it can cause pain, irritation, maybe to the skin. Okay. And they say several of the components can promote tumors, but you'd have to be working with it like every day for years before you would get any type of cancer problems with it. Okay, so it's mostly more of an irritant. Okay. The treatment depends on the area it's affected. Basically, if you get on your skin, wash it off. If you get it in your eyes, you might want to consult a physician. This picture on the bottom left is a picture of my hand pruners after trimming back my euphorbia. I mean, it's all gummy and icky and sticky. So you want to make sure that you keep tools clean. Also, if you can wait until the leaves die back and turn very dry and brittle, and you cut them off, you're not going to be exposed to the sap. Okay. One of my favorite beautiful native plants in southern Nevada, some of you may be familiar with, is the sacred datura. It also goes by the name thorn apple, because you can see the bottom picture is the seed pod from the flower, and it looks just like a thorny apple. It's just very interesting. It also has a common name of Jimson weed, which is short for Jamestown weed, which is where the first known fatality occurred in the Jamestown colony, when somebody said, "Oh, this is pretty, let's see what it tastes like." And they didn't make it. It also has a common name of loco weed, because the chemicals that it contains, the toxic chemicals, are belladonna alkaloids, which are known to cause psychotropic experiences. And they can be fatal if ingested. And what's interesting is the toxicity varies from plant to plant, depending upon how it's growing. What's the soil composition? How much water did it get? How much sunlight did it get? What was the temperature? So we don't really know from plant to plant exactly how toxic it's going to be. Some people grow them in their yards because of the beautiful flowers that they contain. But some people say, I don't want to mess with it because of the potential for the toxic effects. The symptoms would be due to ingestion of any part of the plant, flowers, leaves, or seeds, typically within 1 to 4 hours, with a wide variety of symptoms that you can see. So it's always good to keep pets and any curious children away from the plant. If you do Google sacred datura toxicity, you'll see numerous examples of teenagers, again, who have more curiosity than common sense, who have tried to ingest portions of this and ended up in emergency room, strapped down to a table, just going bonkers and in a lot of pain. The reason it's called sacred datura, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but it's called sacred datura because the local Native Americans used to cultivate it under very controlled conditions, and they would actually ingest portions of the plant for some of their trips, some of their experiences that they would have as part of their culture. Okay, but definitely something we want to avoid exposure to. If you want to grow it, I would generally recommend, as a safety professional, grow it in your backyard where you have more control over who gets in there, versus in the front yard where it could be an attractive nuisance. to animals or people in the area. Okay, so that's your sacred day tour. It also gets pretty big. The one at the university, do have one at UNCE down at Windmill and Paradise. And the plant is probably maybe 5 years old, and it's maybe 15 feet wide and 10 feet long. And it's absolutely humongous plant. Okay, so that's your sacred day tour. Next one, I'm sure a lot of you see this in the springtime as you're driving past vacant lots or out in the wilderness, you'll see globe mallow, which has a pretty little bright orange flower that looks very similar to a hibiscus flower, and the leaf is also similar to a hibiscus plant. It also has a common name of sore eye poppy, because if you look at the leaves, they have a very fine little fuzz on the leaves, which is good for shading the plant when it's in full sun. But if you look at those little hairs under a microscope, they're actually very sharp, pointy objects called stellates. And if you touch the plant with your hands and then you touch your eyes, and if some of those stellates get onto your eye, it can be very painful. So that's why it's important. I mean, I have these in my yard. I love them, but I always wear gloves when I work around them. I cut them back and wash my gloves and try not to avoid contact with my eyes. Okay, another one that's a type of plant that's very common in the valley, in homes and cultivated areas, as well as some of your parks may also have these, are your oleanders. They contain a number of toxins, and they're found in all parts of the plant, whether they're dried or green, and it's a cardiac toxin. So skin contact is the most common exposure route, but if animals like horses were to eat the leaves, or dogs, or if you have a burn pile where you're burning brush, and it includes oleander brush, then you can inhale it, which can also be a hazard. So it's very important to, again, avoid contact with it. I still haven't gotten a final answer about the Boy Scout story. I don't know if anybody else heard about that, where they say that Boy Scouts use the branches to roast their marshmallows, and they ended up in the hospital as a result of that exposure. Okay. Again, a wide variety of symptoms associated with exposure to oleandrin, and also pets such as horses or sheep that eat the leaves can also exhibit drooling. Okay. The treatment depends on the route of entry and the symptoms that may require hospitalization. When my husband and I first moved here, we had about 13 oleanders in our backyard and decided to trim them back, not knowing they were toxic, not wearing gloves. And we just felt like we had the flu for 3 or 4 days after that. And it wasn't until later when we figured out about the toxic, oh, that's why we felt so crappy after we dealt with those bushes. So ever since then, we are very careful with how we work around them. And I put 2 phone numbers here for human poison control center, and also for the animal poison control center, in case you have any concerns about that. You can post those on your fridge or have them on your phone or somewhere in case you have a concern about that. And then I had that the reference at the bottom for the ASPCA poisonous plants website that goes into literally thousands of plants and their potential effects on animals and pets, if you're interested. Okay. Again, wear gloves, keep animals and children away. Don't burn the branches or leaves. We generally don't recommend composting them either. And over time, you may just decide to replace oleanders with a less toxic plant if they're in your yard. Okay. Lantana, again, is another cultivated plant. We sometimes do find those in parks as well as homes. They have very fragrant multicolored flowers. The toxic part generally is in the berries as well as the leaves. And we've seen cases where these berries turn like a really deep purple color, and they can be an attractive nuisance to children or pets. So again, be very careful if you do have lantana. This is typically the time of year where we cut them back very, very low, so you can be removing a lot of those attractive materials and just throwing them away. Okay, those are the symptoms of problems with it. It's mostly common in farm animals that may eat large amounts of it. It's also a uh, possibility for liver damage in children, but it's generally very, very rare to see that. Okay, one last plant we're going to talk about is another very common ornamental, the Texas mountain laurel. It contains alkaloid toxins, um, which are toxic to humans and animals, but it's mainly in the beans. Once it flowers and then it produces this bean pod, they have little red beans inside. And someone would find that on the ground and decide they want to suck on it or eat it or whatever, crush it up. Not a good idea. Okay. And they also may attract cockroaches to your yard. Okay. Again, a variety of symptoms that can occur as a result of that. Okay. So again, those are just some of the major plants that can have cause health problems within individuals. And again, a lot of it is just be aware of that and be careful if you are around those plants. Okay. Let's see how we're doing on time. I think we have enough time. We're going to just briefly go over a little bit of information I have on glyphosate and on hazardous materials. We have a little bit about pesticides and then also naturally occurring asbestos. So I'll just go through this very, very briefly. Okay. I'm sure a lot of you have heard on the news that they are implicating glyphosate as the main ingredient of Roundup that is used a lot as a herbicide for killing weeds and dehydrating crops. So again, in certain park areas or golf courses, you may find that they have been using glyphosate, using Roundup to control weeds. And there was a recent lawsuit in California where a groundskeeper was awarded a very large sum of money, $289 million, for getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a form of cancer. And it was believed to be due to many years of using Roundup on the job. So someone who just, again, occasionally is in areas where this material is found should not feel that there is a real problem with it in the environment. Though numerous agencies have said that repeated exposure is probably a carcinogen based on the evidence. Okay. But what is more troubling is that there are a number of organizations that have looked at pesticide residues in our food. And one of the major issues we've seen is oat products. That Roundup is used on mature oat plants to speed up it drying out before they harvest it, to use it in food for human consumption. Interesting article you can find on the internet called Breakfast with a Dose of Roundup. And it lists at least 20 or 30 different oat products made by major companies and the level of glyphosate in them. And some of those are alarmingly high levels. Okay. One other issue that can kind of add insult to injury is the regulation that covers herbicides and pesticides is called FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And they have a definition in that act of inert ingredients. Is anything, any chemical that's put in the pesticide that's not there to kill the target organism. So unfortunately, chemicals that can be hazardous to humans, but not to the insects, can be added as inert ingredients. And my husband and I, in our environmental consulting business, we did some testing for herbicide, not herbicide, an insecticide that was put on elm trees in the Midwest for Dutch elm disease, and found high levels of benzene, a known human carcinogen, was listed as an inert and was totally legal to spray benzene all over the neighborhood where they had the elm trees. So not only should we be concerned about the glyphosate that we know is in there, but there could be a host of other very hazardous ingredients in our pesticides that they are not required to divulge that could be as hazardous, if not more hazardous, than the ingredients that they list. So again, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but as master gardeners, we generally say using pesticides should be our last resort, and that we should try other organic methods to control insects or fungus or whatever we have going on our plants. And if you need more information on organic gardening, you can contact myself or the Master Gardener program, and we have classes all year long, all about organic gardening and organic farming and that type of thing. Okay. So that was what we have on pesticides. Again, if I'm going over this kind of quickly, I don't know how much of this you're interested in, but if you do have any other questions at the end, I'm glad to discuss any questions you might have or give you further information on where to look. Last but not least, we have naturally occurring asbestos. And there's 6 varieties of asbestos. The one that we find here in Southern Nevada is called actinolite, which is a cancer-causing form of asbestos. And the acronym that they use is NOA, which is naturally occurring asbestos, which means that we have certain parts of the Southern Nevada area where asbestos has formed in the ground naturally. Those areas get eroded away, and then the asbestos is near the surface, and due to normal, erosion and wind patterns, they can be blown around the area where they actually were formed. So we see this has occurred in California, Nevada, Arizona, Washington State, also the eastern seaboard near the Appalachian Mountains and Vermont area. And in Southern Nevada, it has been found in the Boulder City, Henderson, and Lake Mead areas. It was found in very small quantities in the soil. It is not considered to be, this is considered to be one of the more harmful of the 6 asbestos types. And in industrial settings where people are exposed to fairly large quantities, or have been in the past, fairly large quantities for long periods of time, we see a lung scarring called asbestosis and various types of cancer, lung cancer, mesothelioma, and more recently ovarian cancer, believe it or not. But these diseases are related to fairly high long-term exposures. Okay, so this is a map that was published about a year or 2 ago when they were putting in the extension and doing some construction work down by Railroad Pass and by the dam. So this is an article, again, you can look up this article from Earth Magazine, and it shows you a map of the southern tip of Nevada. And the orange, as you can see in the key on the bottom left, is your fibrous amphibole plutons. Again, those are the rock formations that have the more concentrated asbestos in it. And then the alluvium, the yellow, is the area that's eroded away from those sites and has gone on to contaminate nearby areas. And then they show where the waterways are, Lake Mead and Lake Mojave. Okay. They've even done some testing up by Nellis and found very small quantities up there. Now, the rate of illness as a result of this potential exposure, it's slightly above the national average of 1 in a million for mesothelioma, so maybe 2 in a million risk factor. So again, it's not a major problem, but I wanted to bring it to everybody's attention because what we find a lot of times is the media loves to hype up a problem when it's not really that much of a problem. And many times if people hear the word asbestos, they tend to freak out. So I just wanted to level with everybody and say, yes, they've identified asbestos. It's at fairly low levels. And the average person is not going to have that as a major cause of death in their life. But we do want to avoid certain types of dusty activities. Here's a picture of people dirt biking, out in the Lake Mead area. Would you get a higher level of exposure to asbestos doing that? Probably. Could you wear a respirator, an N100 or an N95 if you're going to go do dirt biking out in that area? Not be a bad idea, just to be on the safe side. Okay. They did a lot of industrial hygiene, air testing when they did the Hoover Dam bypass, and they did wonderful controls. I saw a 3-hour presentation at a safety conference of all the controls that they implemented while they did that construction. So I was very impressed with how seriously they took that potential problem and protected the folks that live in Boulder City, Henderson area during that project. Okay. And also gardening is not believed to be a significant risk, but dirt biking, I think, would be a little bit more of a risk. Okay, so believe it or not, you guys have survived the presentations. Oh, Jim made a good point. I had the snakes and lizards listed under the invertebrates, and they are vertebrates. Thank you. I will Yeah, I was a little tired when I think I was putting that slide together, but I will definitely make that change. Thank you, Jim.
Some of those plants, the globe mallow, for instance, we did a seed collection project a couple of years ago with BLM, and they had everyone collecting those seed pods. And the way we did globe mallow was put like a big net around them and then kind of whack the plant and push them in there. But they never mentioned that you could get that it was toxic, that the little hairs were toxic.
Right. Again, I found a lot of this anecdotally from other master gardeners. And that's
Mhm.
why I thought this presentation was helpful because this is a lot of information that people don't get that they really
Yeah,
need to know.
they didn't mention that. The other thing they didn't mention was that when we whacked the seeds off a lot of these plants, we would end up with bugs, and I felt like my skin was crawling for hours afterwards when we'd get home because it
Oh,
just
that
you'd see them in there
that
and
could
they'd
have been
just
the
be moving.
stellates. That could have been bugs, but it also could have been the little stellate hairs that can
No,
cause.
they had legs.
Oh yeah. But
They
if it
have
lasted
legs
hours
and little
afterwards,
faces.
yeah, if it lasted
Yeah.
hours
Oh,
afterwards,
yeah, that
could be the bugs or
could
it
have
could
been
be,
then. Yeah,
yeah, could have
possibly.
been. Now, we have one master gardener who worked for many years in our native wash, and she has actually developed an allergic reaction. If she goes
Oh,
near the
yeah.
plant, she will start to itch. So, just
Oh,
like with anything in our environment, somebody is going to develop an allergy to it. But it occurs after you've been exposed for a certain period of time, then the allergy
hmm.
starts to develop. So people should be aware of that you may have worked with a plant for years, and then all of a sudden when you work around it, you don't feel quite right or something, you start to get symptoms. That is normally what happens as we get older, and then we should be prepared for that.